This is Let Your Voice Be Heard on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. So we left off, and I gave you guys a little bit like background information on why I was really interested in talking about mental health and how, we talked about Sergeant, I forget his name, Robert Bales. I want to say Roger, but it's Robert Bales.
Yes.
Like last March, it was March 11th, 2012. He shot up 2 villages in Afghanistan while he was deployed for the 4th time, and he killed 16 people, including 9 children. And that shooting spree raises any number of questions, including the process the military relies on to screen U.S. troops before deployment and whether or not those assessment tools are good enough to identify those who may need help. I'm sure that many of you are aware, but people who serve in the military and also our veterans, they face different health issues than maybe we civilians do. During wartime, most of the main health concerns are whether you get your limbs blow off or you get, it is true, bombs. Usually a lot of it is usually amputations, and they deal with a lot of those life-threatening injuries, including head injuries, shrapnel that may hit them, gunshot wounds. But a lot of other risks include mental health problems. And those are the ones that usually slip through the crack because they're not obvious. You can't see them bleeding. You can't see them hurting. And these include anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and even substance abuse. So I actually want to put this out there. If you've been in uniform over the past few years, I want to know, what's been your experience with psychological evaluations? It was very hard to tell because everybody has a different idea of whether they're effective or not. So call us up. I mean, anybody can call us up, but definitely if you are in uniform, I really like to hear your opinion. The number is 212-650-6903. You can also tweet at us at BeHeard_radio, or you can leave us a Facebook message at facebook.com/LetYourVoiceBeHeard. Just before we get to our guests, I want to give you guys some statistics. The statistics change a lot depending on who did the survey, but I try to get the best of the best, so hopefully they are as accurate as possible. In the decade since September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, 2,333,972 American military personnel has been deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, or sometimes both. That was actually as of 2011, so it might actually be more now. I'm not really sure the situation because I know we've been trying to scale back and bring a lot of our troops back home. 38 per 100,000 of all Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have committed suicide during the last data available. And the last data. During the last 38 per 100,000 of them have committed suicide of the veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. But all in all, from all the veterans from other wars, even before Iraq and Afghanistan, 1,868 of them committed suicide just in 2009. Wow. So we talking about mostly the newer veterans, the younger guys. Usually, I'm definitely related. I'm friends. My friend is married to one. But there are also consequences of other older wars that they're still suffering. There's a lot of homelessness. There's a lot of issues that they do resolve, and they haven't been resolved from previous war times. And they're not being resolved now. So 6,000 veterans of all generations have committed suicide.
Wow.
In 2009, that was.
Definitely a reoccurring trend.
It is. And out of the newer ones, the latest data is that 349 active duty service members took their own lives in 2012. That's one per day. That's more, that's a lot. True. And it's unacceptable. Like I said, the military, they're not a huge portion of our population. They're about 0.75% of the population. Out of that 0.75, about 8% of them are women. But they are dying in greater numbers than the general population.
It's steadily increasing. Even from 2010 to 2012, the number has progressively gotten higher.
Oh, absolutely. So I think in 2012, the number of suicides rose by 16%.
Yes.
And that doesn't even account the veterans who committed suicide after they leave the military. So this is actually just active. There's no data for the people who've left the military.
This is crazy because, a lot more people have been kind of using the army, the military as a way to make money because they don't, there's no jobs out right now. Yeah. I know a lot of people who I went to high school with, even college with, just went to the military. So, before 5 years ago, if you told me people in the army were committing suicide, I'd think about the Vietnam veterans, the Gulf Coast, the Gulf, Desert Storm veterans. But now we're talking about 21, 22, 23-year-olds who signed up after, right after graduation, or the people who are now hitting their 30s who signed up when the Twin Towers were attacked, or when we went to Iraq these are people who look sound and act just like us in regards to our age.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, most of it, I think it's what it hits close to home. We almost, I don't know, in my opinion, I expected it to be that perhaps maybe they didn't have very good mental health services during Vietnam, and now we do. But it seems like a trend that it never changes. So,
and didn't they actually invest more time and money into the counseling services and into that support system?
That's what news reports say. So I really don't know. I think that maybe they're still just not good enough. But, I mean, this affects a lot of people, not just the service member, but also the family members and their friends. So today, we are speaking with Amy Neiberger-Miller. Correct me if I'm wrong, but of the Tragedy Assistance Programs for Survivors. Amy, are you there?
I am here, and it's Neiberger-Miller.
Neiberger.
Thanks for having us on the show.
Thank you, Amy.
No, thank you so much. And thank you, Selena. Selena was able to get you at the very last minute, but I'm very grateful that you're here because I think that we definitely need to understand this, and it's something that you as a person who perhaps works with veterans and with their families could understand better than I, who just kind of were reading newspaper articles.
Well, we actually provide bereavement support to anyone grieving the death of someone who died while serving in the military. So that might include people whose loved ones died in combat, like my brother. My brother was killed in action in combat, so I actually got help from TAPS for myself, as well as people whose loved ones died in military training accidents or by sudden illness or by suicide. And it's a growing concern within our families. We are seeing more families coming to TAPS grieving a suicide loss of a service member.
Wow. And can you give us an understanding, what is the mental health portion of this, which is what we were talking about, because like I said, a bullet wound, you can see it, you can treat it, but you can't see, somebody who's suffering or who's depressed or who's maybe lying about it. So if you do know, can you let us know what these tests involve, the mental health assessments, what are they like?
Well, they're professional mental health assessments that are given by the military to check for readiness. And, I think some of the things that contribute to people not getting help is there is a lot of stigma about getting help when somebody is suffering from depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or addiction. They're very afraid that people will change the way they view them, and so that stigma often prevents them from reaching out for help and even often contributes to them hiding the fact that they need help. So when they complete a post-deployment questionnaire and they're asked about some of these questions, sometimes people will, may not be entirely truthful, and sometimes their families are very concerned about them, but they don't know how to get help. They don't know what to do, and they don't know what the consequences of asking for help might be. Like, does that mean my loved one might lose their job? Does it mean that they won't be able to deploy? There are a lot of factors that contribute to people not reaching out for help, even though they may need it.
Okay.
Wow.
Thank you for that. And I when I was doing some research, I found that the tests actually, for the most part, are computer-based, and that it's almost like a survey that they'll take before they're deployed, and then sometimes after they come back. And I mean, it depends on, how long they were deployed for, I believe. And a lot of the servicemen that I saw that were being interviewed about this in, other shows or just in general for newspaper articles, they said that they lie because they're actually very excited to be deployed. And if something comes up, then they're going to be pulled to the side and then I'm going to be able to go back. Is this usually the case that these mental health services are given through like a computer and not an actual person?
No, I mean they do some of the questionnaires that way, but I mean mental health services are delivered in person. They do deploy counselors and social workers with the troops who are there too. They do have counselors available. I think one of the challenges though is for people who really want to deploy with their unit, to not go with your unit is very difficult for a service member, because there's very much this brotherhood within the military. And so for someone to, not go with their unit when they're deploying, I mean, that would be, something very difficult for somebody to handle. And, what we often see when you look at completed suicides and you look at what happened in their lives, so often a separation from the unit is part of that story, where maybe the rest of the unit was transferred and went somewhere else. or maybe they were all moved around to different jobs, so now they're not all together anymore.
Right.
And suddenly, you have a very different situation. We had a family come into TAPS where they had a service member who was really struggling a lot, and his unit buddies, they went over and over to help him, over and above. Stayed at his home, tried their best to really make sure he could still do his job even though he was really struggling, and hid the fact that he needed mental health help because they were afraid it would hurt his career.
Right.
And then when all the buddies ended up getting reassigned, because military life very much is about mobility,
Exactly.
then they were gone. And unfortunately, that support network then wasn't in place for him and his family. And then that ultimately he did die by suicide.
Wow.
Leaving a family and, a grieving family to cope with that for the rest of their lives. And so, the unit cohesion is a really important factor. And so when you start looking at some of those studies, some of them will find that, losing those support mechanisms, whatever they are, around them can play a contributing factor, but there's no one single factor when we talk about suicide that is what we can say is why these trends are happening.
Okay.
Hey, Amy, I have a question. If you guys are just tuning in, we're speaking about the surge in military suicides. You can actually call in now and let your voice be heard on the topic. The number is 212-650-6903. So one of the things you said really struck home. If we don't know, Amy, what factors, if it can be a multitude of factors contributing to why our soldiers are committing suicide, then how do you go about fixing the problem if we don't know what's at the root cause?
Well, I think there's a lot of things you can do. For one thing, talk about help seeking and reward it so that when somebody is struggling and having a hard time, it's not a cultural attitude of suck it up and that you're only as strong as your weakest link, but that it's about, how do we help somebody get care? We don't expect for a service member who has a broken leg to not get treatment. We expect for them to go get treatment and to get their leg fixed so they can go back and do their job fully and continue to be part of the force. And we need to view mental health injuries the same way, that if someone is struggling, that they're going to get help and get treatment so they can go back to doing their job and be back doing it to full capacity within the force.
Amy.
Ooh,
Oh, sorry.
So abrupt, Stanley.
Yeah, sorry.
Wow.
Sorry to cut you off like that. He has a deep voice, Amy.
I absolutely meant to cut you. No, I'm kidding. I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to cut you off so abruptly.
That's all right. It's okay. I grew up in the Bronx, so I'm kind of familiar with that.
Amy from the Bronx. Okay. You took that sex train?
Oh, stop.
Amy from the Bronx. So, Amy, my question is, because I like to consider myself as, one of those hard-nosed people who just pushes through everything.
Yes.
It doesn't matter.
Yep.
What I'm feeling does not matter. Accomplish a goal, and that's my mindset. I wouldn't even know I had some sort of mental health issues. Can you give some very simple examples of something that that might be something you would want to pay attention to if you have my kind of mindset, or that your friends can pinpoint?
Yes, because I wouldn't be able to recognize anything in Stanley.
Because
he's robotic when it comes to emotions.
And that's
sometimes.
one of the biggest issues with mental health that you can't recognize, especially with the culture of the military, which is to be tough and you be aggressive and you do not show weakness at any point. And maybe that's one of the things that affects them even more than the general population. But Amy, can you tell us, is there something that we can see? Is there some signs?
Well, I think things that you can look for are, severe depression. Is someone depressed? Does someone have a very high state of vigilance? Are they able to walk out and go to the grocery store with their family? Are they able to go to the mall? Are they able to be out in normal settings and function normally without being in distress? Sleeplessness is often a big factor. If people have very severe anxiety, quite often sleeplessness plays a role in suicide. And also addiction does too. If someone's dealing with a lot of post-traumatic stress and a lot of anxiety, sometimes they self-medicate. And so as a result, alcohol and drug abuse might suddenly start to become a factor, and that might not have ever been part of their life before. Right. And so looking for changes in someone where they're different, and looking for, somebody who's really just having a hard time, who's struggling. I think most people in life, we all face challenges in our lives, but I think that it's okay to ask for help when you reach a point where you really are overwhelmed by just the stress of ordinary life.
Yeah.
And, I think it can be hard sometimes for families to judge because they might think, well, they went to war. They saw things we didn't see. We're here at home. We're safe. We're civilians. And how do we even talk to them about that? Sometimes service members won't talk to their families about those experiences. They really kind of keep them in a box. And so if you notice somebody who's really struggling and having a hard time, encourage them to get peer support. Right. Encourage them to go talk to another veteran who's had a similar experience, somebody else who can understand, because maybe your family really can't.
Exactly.
Because we weren't there. We didn't see it. We don't know. We want to understand.
No,
but
that's true.
Sometimes, having the listening ear of somebody else is really important. And if somebody is suicidal, if they're actually saying, that I'm considering hurting myself, I'm considering killing myself, then you need to get them to help immediately. That is an emergency.
It's
that
almost
is not just somebody's really sad.
Yeah.
And it's something that I don't like to hear people joke about. Now that I know so many families that we work with who have lost loved ones that way, and I think it's really important to give out the national hotline number, which is 1-800-273-8255 for veterans and service members.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. No, it definitely is true. And I think, we have a responsibility to take care of them. They're out there putting their lives at risk for us so that we can be safe, so that we're never attacked again, so that we don't have to go through that. And I think sometimes we forget how definitely difficult it is. And while we can't be in their shoes, we never could unless we do that. It is important. But, Amy, we have to take a short break. But we'll be right back. Can you hold on a few minutes?
Sure.
All right. Thank you, Amy. We're talking to – look at this. I'm like a mess right now. I was like trying to find the organization, and I'm like, where are we talking to? But we're talking to Amy of the Tragedy Assistance
Program for
Survivors. I wanted to say TAPS. The whole time I wanted to say TAPS, and I'm like, what is the acronym? Thank you, Amy. We'll be right back. I'll let your voice be heard.
I'd do anything to take you from your girl. She don't love you, but she has you in her blood. Here in my soul, I die 'cause I can't let go. I'd do anything to take her from your mind. Everybody knows she wants you for your ride. Her glitter's not gold, baby. Your heart can't be sold. Yeah, I'm making noise, telling all the world that I'm coming for you, boy. There'll be no mercy now.
This is Let Your Voice Be Heard, and we're back talking about suicide in armed forces. And I'm going to give the mic to Patricia because it's her segment and not mine.
We're talking about military mental health with Amy from the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, which my brain did not want to say earlier today, and I apologize. I was like tongue-tied. And
I have the opposite effect. My brain says any and everything, as you guys have witnessed.
I wanted to say TAPS because it's so much easier, but, I wanted people to understand what the program was about. And, we left off, and, Amy was talking about some of the signs that our military men face and how they show signs of depression or any kind of mental illness. And, I think that we have the stigma of like, oh, well, and it happens a lot because when I was doing my research, a lot of the comments that people leave on articles, which, I know it's a horrible thing to say, but I'm sure that somebody believes it. We're saying like, well, they chose that lifestyle.
Oh, really?
Like, they were like, listen, we understand that it's horrible, but they chose that lifestyle for themselves. So it's kind of like part of the job, which is a horrible thing to say. And I just want to bring it back down to earth, to us. Everybody experiences like anxiety and post-traumatic stress. I had a car accident, and it was a very minor car accident. Nothing happened to me. There was no blood, no nothing. And I was very shaken up. For a few weeks after that, I kept seeing, people crossing the street like blocks away and like hitting my brake. And like anybody who would be like, yeah, you would, because, you want to avoid that. You don't want to be in that situation. Every time I would go by that same intersection, I would jump a little bit. If a car, I would make sure that there was absolutely no car coming. So this is something that we all experience. So now when you think about our military men, they experience that, 1,000 times worse. I have a coworker who has been deployed 3 times already. He's been in combat, and he tells me that every time he comes back, it takes him about 6 months to actually adjust back to life here. 6 months, you're usually going to go deployed back. He says that he experiences a lot of noise, scares him. So in the middle of the night, if he hears like a car passing, like he freaks out, or anything. It could be like a balloon popped, and they have a lot of tension. So it is something that we can be very vigilant. And Amy, you're still there?
I'm still here.
Oh, thank you. So I want to take it back to like your organization. I know when Selena was the one that booked you, she was helping me get a gas, and she was telling you guys have a very different approach to this. She says that you guys focus on the family members. She says, you don't focus on the statistics. You just focus on everybody who needs help. So I want to know what do you guys do to help the family members of military men and the military men and women who come back and are showing some sign of mental illness? How do you help them adjust? How do you get them better?
Well, we actually work with the families of those who've died. And so our approach is very much, how do you figure out what your life is going to be now? And we provide really specialized support services for families grieving a suicide loss. We actually hold a number of events around the country throughout the year that families can attend in person. We hold grief seminars for adults and good grief camps for children. We hold a national gathering annually just for suicide survivors, but we also integrate them within all of our other programming and support for families of the fallen so that they're able to be connected still to that military family and start working through their loss and what this means in their lives. The research is it's about 5 to 7 years to reach a new normal after suffering the traumatic loss of a loved one. And so for our families, this is a really long journey, and the same stigma that prevents service members and veterans sometimes from reaching out for help if they're struggling also sometimes prevents their surviving families after they've died from reaching out for help too.
Wow.
After a media interview like this, we'll often have someone call us who was out there, who was struggling to cope with how do I live my life now that my loved one has died by suicide, and what do I do? Their loved one served in the military. They're ashamed of how they died sometimes, and they really want to, they don't know what to do. How do you put your life back together? Yeah. That's a really life-altering event. And so for us, it's about how do we provide support to those families, and we do that through peer support by connecting them with other people who've gone through a similar loss.
Wow. Thank you for that work. That's actually very good because people never think about it. They always think like, oh, well, he committed suicide. The pain is over. And you don't think about the people who left behind or she did. And guys, we're talking to Amy from the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. And if you have any questions for us on military mental health, if you are military personnel, if you're a family member, please call us up. The number is 212-650-6903. And Selena had a question for you, Amy.
Yes, definitely. And you can also tweet us at BeHeard_radio. The question I had is, you said that now TAPS provides specialized services for the family members of people left behind from military suicides. And my question is, how is that service so different from anyone who commits suicide and as opposed to someone committing suicide in the military?
Well, military culture is different. And, it's not, when somebody dies, people don't just lose their loved one. They also lose often their connection to that culture. If the family lived on a base, if there's a wife and children left behind or a husband and children left behind, then, they have to leave base housing and they have to move. Their whole identity as a military family may be radically altered. Because instead of being a military family that literally traveled the globe, serving their country and living on bases far away, they're now going back to a hometown that maybe they haven't lived in for 10 years.
Wow.
Maybe they just visited there for the holidays once in a while. And so around that family, if you look at what supports are around that family, all of a sudden they're losing and leaving behind them the last home they lived in with the person who died. They're losing the support of all the people they knew, that close-knit military community that exists on bases around the world. They're leaving that. They're moving away. And now they're out of that. And the children are losing their classroom at school. They're going to have to go to a new school and make new friends. And now they're going to be a kid who doesn't have a parent. And that's a really hard adjustment for people to make. and it's really hard to do it alone. And so for families, we really provide a lot of good support by pairing up a widow with another widow who's had a similar loss. So like we might match up an Army widow who lost her husband by suicide with another Army widow who also lost her husband by suicide. The difference is they'll be a few years apart from when their husbands died, and that one of them will have been through our peer mentor training and will be trained in how to be a companionable support that, is really helping her think through, okay, what do you need to do now? What goes next? And then we have a lot of other support services as well. We help families who, maybe they don't know how to request a change on their loved one's headstone. And, when you're grieving, dealing with a lot of paperwork and bureaucracy can be really problematic and really frustrating. And so having somebody there at TAPS who can really help families who are having a hard time with benefits or with learning something about their loved one's death, we really try to provide a lot of wraparound support for these families, so that they can, build a new life,
right.
And it's sad that they have to build it without their loved one. Nobody can ever take that wound away from them, that's happened in their lives. We can't take that away from a child. Exactly. As much as I think all of us would like to take that pain away from them.
You could just try to alleviate it, right?
There's nothing we can do, but we have to reach out to these families and say, okay, this is what's happened in life, and now how do you figure out how to step forward again?
Right. I actually want
to strength again, and that's what we give people. I think is that ability to, figure things out. We give them a safe place to do that, where nobody judges you and says, "Oh, your loved one died by suicide," or "Oh, you're angry. You shouldn't be angry. You should just be proud that they served their country."
Yeah, I guess
we don't judge anybody for how they're grieving.
Yeah,
all right.
There's definitely a lot of stigma with the military.
I'd like to take things. I'm jumping in again.
Ahead.
I'd like to take things into a different perspective. I want to take it into the experience of someone who is not ingrained into that military lifestyle or that military community. I want to talk about the people who come in and join the military because they need a means for making, exact means for making money for their family. So say someone like me who grew up in East New York, and the only reason I joined the military was because I knew that it was going to give me a certain amount of money every 2 weeks or every month to take care of my family. I commit suicide. I am now gone. What happens to those benefits? Mm-hmm. The money, the health insurance, and everything else like that, and how does that affect the families?
Well, actually, the family would receive life insurance. And they would the same life insurance that's given for other military losses, which is $400,000 through the Service Members Group Life Insurance Plan. The widow and children would also receive survivor benefits, and those are ongoing benefits linked to the rank of the service member at the time of the death that are paid through the VA. There's also burial benefits. They receive the same marker in the cemetery, the same headstone. All those benefits are in place. I think the difference is how people view the death. My brother died in combat, and so many people hold that up as a very heroic death. And, there are people who will contact the family and say, we want to make you a quilt, or we want to make a picture of your brother for you because he's such a hero. And, those people are very kind and I think want to do something nice for my family.
Right.
At the same time, I don't think those calls go to families where their loved ones died by suicide. And, and what we do at TAPS is we just say, look, everybody comes at loss in different ways. We all got here, into this unfortunate club that we're now in of people who are bereaved. But for us, it's about how do we talk about our loved ones and remember their lives and their service and what they gave this country.
Exactly.
They volunteered to join the military. It's an all-volunteer force. They all took the oath. They all raised their right hands and swore an oath to protect and defend our country to the point of giving their lives. And some of them did give their lives.
Exactly.
And so, how do we talk about that?
Yeah.
For me, if I make my brother's death and his whole life only about the moment it took him to die,
right.
I personally feel like I am robbing myself and him of his life.
Exactly.
Because then I won't remember the funny stories and the good things about his life. People remember him because of how he died, and people definitely view suicide death very differently than they view combat death.
Yeah.
But for me, I have to remember those pieces about his life that are special and important to me. And I think for a lot of our families, that's what it ultimately can become about, is how do I remember the gifts they gave me